Total War Warhammer has been out for almost 6 months now, and it's been a thoroughly entertaining ride in my opinion. It had a relatively smooth release, the fantasy setting is awesome, the gameplay is rewarding, and I've really enjoyed playing it for the 325 hours I currently have on record. I foresee many more being invested over the coming months and years, as more content and more of the races that make the Warhammer universe such a great setting for a Total War game get added. With that said, the game certainly has its share of flaws, as most games do. Even the great ones, when you can objectively see through the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia, you can usually find plenty of bugs and problems in the classics as well. I think Siege gameplay currently is a pale shadow of its former self, especially if you're a multiplayer fan. You can watch any of mine or Oakley's Attila or Rome 2 Siege battles to realize what we're missing in Warhammer Sieges. I like the direction multiplayer is headed in general, but it still needs a lot of work, and I will always be an advocate for deep customization like what Shogun 2 offered, and until Avatar Conquest makes its long-awaited return, I will probably never be truly satisfied with the Total War Warhammer multiplayer suite. And then there's the magic system. This was advertised as one of the defining features of Total War Warhammer, something that would set the gameplay apart from previous Total Wars. And it definitely has. You can tell that serious effort has been put into the system. When you look at something like Gehenna's Golden Hounds bouncing through an enemy line, or a chain lightning vortex rippling across the battlefield, the spell effects can be amazing, and give you a feeling that's unlike anything you've experienced in previous iterations of the series. Show a family member or a friend these spell effects for the first time, and I bet they'll be genuinely impressed, if not blown away by them. But for all of that flash, there is sometimes very little substance, and the balancing of magic thus far has been borderline atrocious. I 100% understand how busy Creative Assembly is right now. New races, new factions, hopefully new features on the way as well, and balancing in general is a really difficult job. I do not envy the job that balance testers have, but the magic system in Total War Warhammer needs some serious reworking in my opinion, and in this video, I'll do my best to enumerate the problems with magic as I see them, so that we can hopefully get some dialogue opened up about these issues. Some of these you will most certainly have heard discussions on forums or on Reddit, or noticed yourself when playing. Some are blatantly obvious, some are a little bit more nuanced and difficult to spot. So with all that said, let's get into it. Right off the bat, it's important for me to note that spell damage still does not scale with unit size. I don't know if there's a technical reason why CA can't work with percentages and instead have to deal with flat values, but this doesn't make that much sense to me. Spirit Leech, even after the significant nerf, still does absurd damage for the Winds of Magic cost on small unit size because every Lord and unit has much less HP, but on ultra unit size, it's like being bitten by a mosquito. It barely does any damage. I perfectly understand the game is balanced around large unit size, that's where all of CA's balancing efforts go into, but there are people with inferior computers or supercomputers who like playing on different unit sizes or have to play on different unit sizes, and I feel like Magic shouldn't be dramatically different on different unit sizes just because units have different size HP pools. That's where percentages would come into play and be much more efficient, I think. It can never be perfectly balanced between unit sizes, even if damage does become based on percentages, because that would include rebalancing the size of each area of effect spell and a bunch of other things that I don't expect CA to do, but I still feel like this problem shouldn't still be persisting to the extent that it has 6 months after launch. We can also say that the vast majority of damage, bombardment, and vortex spells, the ones that have had the most work put into them in terms of visual effects, spells like Chain Lightning and Purple Sun, are woefully underperforming, while area of effect buff and debuff spells are often very, very good. In general, most Lords of Magic have one or two legitimately useful spells that you will see in most games, maybe one situational spell that can be good on rare occasion, and the rest are, frankly, utter trash. Let's take the Lore of Fire, for example. Cascading Fire Cloak and Flaming Sword of Ruin are very decent spells. Any Lore of Fire caster would be remiss not to bring them to the field. Armor Piercing, significant melee defense, weapon damage, and magical attack buffs for a large portion of your army are very nice things to have. In a very rare instance, against the vampire counts when you're expecting a Mortis engine, the Fireball spell can also be good to bring, as when overcasted it can do significant damage to a unit that is typically very hard to bring down. But that's kind of where Lore of Fire ends, and let's say 2.5 spells, and that's kind of being a bit generous. That's because the other 3 spells in the Lore of Fire are absolute garbage. We'll talk about why vortexes aren't performing in just a little bit, but for right now, let me just say that they aren't performing. They are impossible to control beyond where you place them, and they often do negligible damage for the second or two they are able to stay on target before veering off into the great beyond. This is true of almost every vortex spell in the game, with the exception of Wind of Death, which funnily enough does not behave like all the other vortexes because it travels in a straight line. So what this means is, and it's true for literally every single lore in the game, you don't really have a choice in what spells to bring, do you? Just the illusion of choice. For a whopping 15 Winds of Magic, I can either summon a vortex that will, in all likelihood, do close to 0 damage before veering off into nothingness, or I can buff up half my army with 36% armor piercing damage and 36 melee defense for 5 Winds of Magic. Really tough call there. I can either spend lots of Winds of Magic for a spell that has a great chance of doing no damage, or I can significantly buff up 50% of my forces. But it's not just the Lore of Fire that has this illusion of choice. We can go down the list of lores of magic in this game, and the majority will have 2 spells that are quite usable, and 4 spells that are utterly garbage. Lore of the Little Wa, for example, you'll pretty much only see people bring Itchy Nuisance and Sneaky Stabbin'. Guess what? They both happen to be area of effect melee buffs and debuffs. I think you're beginning to notice a trend here. Damage spells suck, AoE buffs and debuffs are good, which is a shame in and of itself, because like I already mentioned, the damage and vortex spells are in general really cool and impressive looking, and the buff spells usually just put a big shiny circle on the ground and put colors over a unit's head. So they're a little bit more bland and boring and blend in with all the other buff spells. Now the fact that AoE buffs and debuffs are so much better than other spells is a problem in and of itself, because it incentivizes blobbing up, and incentivizes you to not bother too much with flanking, and it incentivizes you to play in a substandard manner where you cram as many units as you can into the area of effect or into a Death Star. Now of course, there are plenty of ways to punish blobs in this game, but one of the most obvious ones isn't very good at it. It's a vicious circle then, because vortexes can't reliably punish these blobs, and then you begin to notice how one problem with magic gets amplified by all the other problems with the system, and these just kind of build on each other. It's worth noting that buffs and debuffs are pretty much never worth casting unless they have an area of effect, and that the mana cost for overcasting spells, and indeed mana cost for spells in general, is often completely out of whack and has no driving theme or reason behind it across the board. They're all over the place. For example, Wyson's Wild Form from the Lore of Beasts gives plus 22% weapon damage and 15 armor for 5 mana on a single unit. If I overcast it for 8 mana, 3 Winds of Magic more, I can hit everyone in a 45 meter radius. That could pretty easily hit more than half of my melee units. There's no real choice there. For less than twice the cost, I can quadruple or quintuple my efficiency. Why would I ever cast a buff or debuff on a single unit when I can cast it on 6 or more units for only an incremental increase in Winds of Magic? It doesn't make sense. So let's move on to vortexes for a minute. Why are vortex spells underperforming? Well, there are a variety of factors at play here. Perhaps the biggest is the fact that their damage output is tied to the mass or lack thereof of an enemy unit, which is completely unintuitive and very likely unintentional on CA's part. For those who don't know, there are a variety of vortexes in Total War Warhammer, like the Lore of Light's Banishment and like the Lore of Death's Purple Sun, which pick up units and toss them around like ragdolls. These spells can utterly decimate units if they hit perfectly, which is incredibly rare in and of itself, but the receiving unit has to be high mass, which typically equates to high armor. So Chaos Warriors, Dwarf Ironbreakers, these kind of units can take pretty serious damage if the vortex happens to land well, and in a second I'll explain why that so rarely happens. But on the flip side, you could land the most gorgeous Wind of Death or Purple Sun on the biggest blob of Empire Crossbowmen or Karn Race, known to man and end up doing close to 0 damage. Why is that? Because despite picking up any unit that comes in contact with it, archers and ethereal units are low mass and are thrown out of the way of the damage component of vortex spells, resulting in only tiny slivers of HP loss, while high mass units are not thrown out of the way of the damage component and continuously take damage in the vortex. There is no way CA intended this because it's completely illogical. Why would a vortex care if you are high or low mass? No matter how much armor you have on you, probably aren't as dense or massive as a literal black hole being summoned into the material plane like Purple Sun. It picks you up, it chews you into little itty bitty pieces, and it spits you out. Or at least it should. Not so in Total War Warhammer. We even saw this before launch. If you remember the Greenskins vs. Bretonnia preview that Total War Official did on their YouTube channel, Azhag cast Purple Sun on a Bretonian artillery crew, and they took essentially 0 damage because of their low mass. That still hasn't been fixed yet. And I really don't want to hear about how disrupting a single unit's formation is worth 12 wins of magic. It's not. There has to be a significant damage component as well, or the spell just won't get used. There's a reason you will almost never see vortexes used in competitive tournament play, because they are not an efficient use of your magic. Another huge reason vortex spells underperform is the speed in which they move and the massive area they can cover. In tabletop, the AoE for many vortex spells was, and this is going to be an estimation, but let's say 1 to 50th or 1/100th of the playing surface. Maybe less, maybe more, depending on what surface you're playing on. Vortexes themselves could move a few inches here, a few inches there. They could certainly veer off a unit and into open space, but before doing so, they could cause some pretty serious carnage. In Total War Warhammer, this is not the case. We've all seen it. We summon a glorious looking chain lightning or a burning head on top of a big blob of enemies, expecting to see them just get mowed down by the dozens or the hundreds, only to see it do pitiful damage for the second it manages to stay on target before veering off into the sunset. On a typical battle map in Total War, your vortex spell is going to cover, let's say, 1/1000th of the entire playing field. That may even be a generous estimation. And so, combined with the high rate of speed and huge amount of variability in which a vortex can spin, you aren't getting enough coverage on enemy units to do significant damage. And the vortex will, the vast majority of the time, go flying out into open space after seconds of doing essentially nothing. I think vortex spells need to be a lot slower and have a smaller area of variability in where they can spin, so they can actually stay on target occasionally. I also have to laugh a little bit when I look at the design of some vortex spells. Let's take Flamestorm, for example. It costs 15 wins of magic to unleash the normal version, but when you overcast it, it costs 26 wins of magic. For this increased cost, the vortex lasts for about 50 seconds, roughly twice the amount of time as the normal version, which sounds reasonable. But then you use it in practice and realize that on average, that Flamestorm is going to spend 95% of that 50 seconds flying off into the vast plains of Galbaraz, as functional as a group of fireworks on the 4th of July. Who honestly gives a crap how long it lasts if it never stays on target more than a few seconds? Perhaps just doing twice the DPS might be a better solution for an overcasted Flamestorm than just simply making it last longer. Now, all of this may indeed be acceptable if CA says, hey, we don't want vortex spells to be too powerful, so we're keeping them inaccurate with frequently poor DPS. And you can make an argument that's completely fine. We don't want overpowered vortexes either. We don't want vortex spells literally deciding every game. We don't want vortex spells easily one-shotting powerful units every time they're summoned. That's not good for game balance. This is still Total War, where troop micromanagement and army composition and strategy should trump everything else. Those things should always come first in a strategy game. But if CA wants to keep them weak, they need to change the mana costs on them, because the gap between mana costs and what you get for each spell is so out of whack. Don't make me spend 15 mana to cast Flamestorm or 12 to cast Purple Sun when I can get a much more efficient, cost-effective AoE buff or debuff that's guaranteed to hit all of its targets for 7 or 8 wins of magic. With all that said, I would be remiss not to mention that some spells in this game are beautifully designed. Net of Amantok is a great example in my opinion. You could probably make a valid argument that it's a little bit OP when it's overcasted. 42 seconds of not being able to move is an eternity when battles frequently last 6 to 8 minutes, but that is the kind of unique spell that I would love to see more of in this game. It has a clear, unique purpose of tying down enemy units so you can countercharge, shoot them to death, or run away, and it functions admirably in its role. It is expensive at 19 Winds of Magic when overcasted, but it is actually useful and does something besides just giving flat rate bonuses, and I think the cost of the Winds of Magic is a good value for what you're getting out of the spell. I think Wind of Death is in a great spot as well and does what it says on the tin. It can single-handedly win a battle for you, but there is a 5-second period where someone can see that it is coming and get their units out of the way. And just in general, if you see a vampire or necromancer moving to the flank of a long line of engaged infantry, you should know exactly what's coming. There's more than enough counterplay to get away from the spell, but if you're not paying attention, you will be punished very heavily. I'd like to see more vortexes work like that. One thing of note, a spell from the Lore of Fire that didn't make the cut into the final game was Fulminating Flame Cage. On tabletop, this spell does severe damage to infantry if and only if they happen to move. This is the kind of utility spell that I would love to see more of, where there is an obvious choice that needs to be made. I can either stop moving the unit and allow my opponent to outmaneuver me or shoot me to death, or I can eat the damage and attempt to stop my opponent from doing sneaky things. The game would benefit from having more spells like that, I think. Along the same line of thinking, a lot of the movement buffs in this game, like Barona's Time Warp, give you a kind of lame 24% increase in speed, which makes you wonder if anyone will even notice it. It's really hard to notice a spell that's only giving you such a small incremental increase in speed. But in tabletop, it doubles their movement speed. That would make speed buffs actually worth using and more obvious. When an infantry unit starts running as fast as cavalry and suddenly becomes a great flanker out of nowhere, that's a utility spell that's really noticeable and can make a big impact on a game, allowing something like a greatsword to flank all the way behind an enemy's line and charge in from the rear. That's a game-winning kind of spell. But it's not broken. It's something that can be used well if the player uses it well, but it's not in and of itself inherently a problem. That conservative style is something I'd like to see CA move away from as the trilogy moves forward, and it does seem like they're heading in that direction with each DLC. But it's still apparent in campaign for other stuff as well. Seeing a +3 melee attack increase on the skill tree for my legendary lord doesn't really get me excited, much like 24% speed from Barona's Time Warp doesn't get me excited. Now I know that some people want real transformation spells given into the game, but I don't think that's particularly realistic. I think making them summon spells was an elegant solution and a much better one than what we could have had, just making a caster faster or stronger with buffs. It would have been tragic seeing Transformation of Kadan be a buff spell that gave +34 melee attack. I would have literally cried. But making them summoning spells is easier to animate while still remaining mostly true to the nature of the spell. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to animate a beast wizard morphing into a manticore and then morphing back, so I don't think it's realistic to expect that in the trilogy ever. One of the biggest issues I have with Creative Assembly's magic balancing thus far is their tendency to use a hammer instead of a scalpel. Every time a spell is too good and becomes the talk of the town, it gets nerfed into oblivion instead of actually rebalanced. Remember how Spirit Leech, Fate of Buna, and Devolve were too strong during their respective launches? Remember how Magic Missiles were way too efficient at sniping enemy lords and insta-winning you games? Well, most spells that were too good have become absolutely garbage after their round of nerfing and are almost never used anymore. Spirit Leech can still be okay against ethereal heroes, but it's still pretty crappy. Why would someone ever take Fate of Buna to take away 1/3 of an elite unit's health for 15 mana? Sure, it was too strong before, but slamming it with the nerf hammer instead of using a scalpel to rework it is not the play. And same with Devolve. It was way too good for sure, then it gets brought to CA's attention, and the spell is completely atrocious and never used ever now. It literally does 1/8 of an enemy unit's HP for 16 mana if you overcast it. It's AoE, but it only does that damage if the units stay in that AoE for the full 22-second duration. And you're only doing 1/8 of their HP pool in damage anyway. For that much mana, it's just not worth it. So, I wanted magic missiles nerfed a bit because they single-handedly decided games, and the Lord sniping meta before was completely out of control. But many of them are just incredibly inaccurate now. Like, I just shot a Gaze of Nagash at a Griffin who wasn't even moving from across the map. Like, he was literally staying still. It wasn't even a regular game. It was just a test. I did Gaze of Nagash, and it just completely whiffed past the massive Griffin. Not a single one of the magic missiles hit the target. And a Griffin is a really big target. So, and Gaze of Nagash used to be one of the best magic missiles. So, it's just weird to me that Creative Assembly just nerfs these spells into the ground instead of just rethinking how they can be utilized effectively. Like, for example, being good at doing damage to single target monsters or big targets like the Mortis engine. And then there are some lores of magic in this game that are just actually horrendous from the ground up. The lore of metal is a great example, probably the best example in the game. It functions nothing like it did in tabletop or in the lore. So the lore of metal had a bunch of spells that wounded enemies on their armor save, which effectively means it was the bane of high armor factions. Go figure. If you were a Chaos Warrior or a Demigryph Knight with a really high armor save, you pooped your pants on tabletop when someone casted a Searing Doom magic missile at you because it uses your high armor value against you. In Total War Warhammer, we get a bombardment spell that has no special interaction with high armor units whatsoever and does negligible damage to blobs of infantry even when it does hit for the full duration. Seriously, try it. Go into a custom game, drop Searing Doom on the top of a unit on large unit size, and watch the pathetic amount of damage it will do to the unit. I've gotten sexy casts of this spell where you can barely see the health bar of an opponent's unit move. Like 300 damage when units have 5,000 plus health. So yeah, it's like really bad. Plague of Rust, for another example from the lore of metal, subtracts 15 armor from a single individual unit. Incredibly useful when anything that should be worth casting it on has armor values of 100 or more. So, hey, let's cast it on this heavily armored Ironbreaker and reduce their armor to 105. Wow, that really didn't do very much. Didn't do anything meaningful when they still have over 100 armor. You're not turning their high armor against them in any way, shape, or form. 15 armor is almost useless when a unit has 120. It barely does anything. So people don't use lore of metal for a reason. It's really awful. Casters like Balthazar Gelt and Kemmler have no advantages in terms of their magic over necromancers or lower level wizards. Their spells don't do more damage, they don't have access to more spells or better spells. There's just no reason to take them. They're squishy as hell, their magic isn't good. Why would you bring them? CA could introduce a mechanic where Kemmler or Gelt have significantly smaller winds of magic costs associated with their spells when compared to a regular necromancer or wizard, which would then allow them to cast more. But at the moment, nothing like that exists, so there's no differentiation between Kemmler, who in the lore is a much better caster than some random scrub like Helman Gorst, but in the game, there's nothing to differentiate the high-level Lord casters from the lower-level hero casters. And then I have a few nitpicks with Necromancy. I personally feel like summoning zombies should be encouraged in most battles, but the incredibly low range on the spell and relatively significant mana cost associated with it and 9 winds of magic means people usually won't bring the zombie spell. And I might be okay with that cost if you could summon zombies from like 100 meters away, meaning you could summon them on artillery crews or something like that in the back lines, but you can't even efficiently block charges with them because your Necromancer pretty much has to be standing almost on top of them to cast the spell. And then you look at other summon spells like a Cygor or a Manticore at 28 wins and 21 wins respectively. Is a Cygor only 3 times better than a zombie? No, of course not. It costs 1600 gold to field, a zombie costs 150. A Manticore costs 1000, so why are zombies so expensive in Winds of Magic to summon? There's a lot of little things like that that kind of leave you scratching your head a bit. I would talk about how adding a dispel mechanic where you could completely prevent an enemy spell from going off would be good and would allow magic to become even more powerful because there'd then be counterplay that allows you to prevent those spells from going off. but I honestly don't think CA will implement it, and I'm not sure it could be done in a manner that is fun and makes sense and would be a good gameplay mechanic. I think it was a gameplay and design choice from CA where they probably sat down and agreed that preventing casters from casting just would not be fun for players, especially if it's happening to you. Now, just as a side note, before I launch into my conclusion, it's important to remember that in the background gameplay, a lot of these spell tests that were done throughout the video were done in ideal conditions, creating blobs for each other and not moving our units away from the vortex or spell once it goes off. So if you're saying to yourself, those spells are doing okay damage in some instances, I don't really see the problem, realize that on a real battlefield, these spells would typically be doing way less damage because formations would be in spaghetti line or spread out more, people wouldn't be blobbing anywhere near as much as we blobbed in the video, that kind of thing. Just try it for yourself. Play some real battles against an opponent and see how often you can make a big impact with a damage or vortex spell. It's relatively rare. There are of course exceptions like Flock of Doom and Wind of Death, but going through each lore of Magic you can find a lot of spells underperforming, and even some entire lores like the lore of Metal that need serious help in terms of their viability. So in conclusion, I certainly do not have all the answers here. I did my best to include some very simple fixes that might be able to get implemented at some point, but there are lots of people in this community who have a really good grasp on game balance who would love to help CA come up with solutions to these problems. We've even had people from the community who are very knowledgeable and have had literal careers in game balance offer their services to CA for free, and I think it would be a good thing for the game if CA would work hand in hand with the community a bit more to help flesh out their Magic system and game in general. People like Agony Duck, people like Hero, who literally have careers in quality assurance and game balance, they are great sources that I think CA could use just to talk to. Like, I'm not talking about being forced into a situation where they have to listen to every word they say or treat their ideas like divine mandate, but I think it is helpful to be able to talk to community members who are very knowledgeable and intelligent and maybe get some ideas from those people, and if they send you emails, possibly respond to them. So anyway, I think it would be a good thing for the game if CA would work hand in hand with the community a bit more to help flesh out their Magic system and game in general. I think Atto and other gameplay balance employees at Creative Assembly have been doing a great job thus far. I think that multiplayer balance is at its best state since launch. It's actually in quite a good spot right now. Could certainly use some more work, but it's still pretty good right now. And I think that those employees have been doing a great job. I think there's still a ton of room for improvement though. I have high standards for my games, especially Total War games. I always expect them to be utterly amazing, so with my high standards, there does come some room for improvement there for sure. I think the current Magic system provides a great framework for what Magic could eventually be, but it does need some reworking and rebalancing to get it to a place where each spell and lore of Magic has a logical wins of Magic cost and can make a corresponding impact on the battle depending on that cost. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what you think about the video or Magic and Total War Warhammer below in the comment section, and I will see you all next time.